Good morning, everyone. It's Monday, July 12th. Welcome to Rising. We have a big show for you today with Kentucky Senate candidate Charles Booker and friend of the show, Zed Jelani, plus all-star panelists Colin Ruggiero and Philip Wegman are here for Team Rising.
But first, we wanted to talk about the protests going on in Cuba. The protests erupted on Sunday. According to the New York Times, it's a discontent the country hasn't seen in nearly 30 years. The Times attributed the demonstrations to an economic crisis worsened by the pandemic.
Now, in the U.S., we saw a wave of support. In Miami, thousands of Americans marched in solidarity with Cubans speaking out against their government. Joining us to weigh in on what is happening in Cuba is historian Andres Pertierra. Welcome, Andres. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on to talk about this important topic.
Absolutely. Now, there's already, I think, a lot of backlash in the United States about the way the media, the legacy media, has framed what's happening on the ground in Cuba. So if we could just dive right in, if you could sort of explain for everybody what's really happening on the ground, how big these demonstrations actually are, and what really motivated them.
Sure. So these protests are, right now in the media, there's kind of like a tug of war between two very oversimplified narratives with political motivations on both ends. One is a tug of war saying, no, it's only economic sanctions and it's only the blockade, the embargo and economic policies. And then on the other, U.S.'s economic policies to damage Cuba's economy and the shortages caused by like the collapse of tourism because of COVID and all these other economic issues. And then on the other side, you have an explanation that's just, no, it's just politics. This is just about wanting a political change in Cuba, a change in political system, about human rights. That's the only issue. When like the obvious answer is that it's always been, it has both. It is necessarily both components, even though there's a lot of attempts to kind of oversimplify it.
Well, Andres, doesn't the U.S. media's kind of own narrative about these protests sort of undermine its point that this is about politics? In other words, the U.S. media is saying that this is about complaints about the healthcare system, about rationing, about the economy, and no doubt, a significant problem that the economy is having is that because of the coronavirus pandemic, tourism collapsed all over the Caribbean, all over the world, and an economy that was heavily dependent on European and other tourism suffered greatly. But there's no questioning the fact that the greatest driver of the economic malaise would be the sanctions. The fact, we've all heard how, Cuba has done such a wonderful job producing vaccines, yet a lot of the population is not vaccinated because they can't get syringes in because of the sanctions, because of the blockade. So isn't the fact that the U.S. media is saying that it's economic conditions that are driving the protests, doesn't that make the case that it actually is the boycott and the sanctions, the blockade and the sanctions, that is ultimately underneath this driving what's going on the island?
I think that yes, as kind of like a triggering factor, right? So you have it is really what is leading to food scarcity, medicine scarcity, fuel scarcity. The blackouts are coming back like in the 1990s. Things are getting bad. It doesn't seem to be quite as bad in the 1990s, the so-called special period where Cuba lost 70% of its trade almost overnight with the fall of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc. But it's getting very bad, and that has definitely been the detonating factor for this. With the health crisis, the pandemic, with COVID cases rising to record numbers in Cuba, including deaths rate rising to record numbers in Cuba, from COVID, all of that being very much a detonating factor. The thing is, it's also been that the government has been very much kind of outmaneuvered in terms of messaging and the like by various opposition sectors who have very successfully united in their arguments for why people should protest economic issues with long-standing more political and rights issues.
Yeah, can we get into the political and rights issues, because there was a pretty major protest also in November, not as major as what we're seeing happen right now, and that was over the oppression of political dissidents and artists and the like. To what extent is what we saw happen over the weekend also about those human rights abuses, the crackdown on dissidents that the Cuban government has initiated? How much of that is, in addition to what we just talked about, the triggering factors of sanctions, how much of it also stems from the way the Cuban government treats political dissidents? So, I mean,
Cuba has been very repressing political dissidents for decades. When I studied in Cuba for 5 years, that's where I did my undergraduate degree. Like the Damas de Blanco, who were protesters, the women in white. I'm not going to give a long explanation of who they are because we have a short time. But like they were being there was repression against them. There were like all kinds of government orchestrated kind of ways to make their lives miserable. But that's been going on for decades. The difference is with what happened last year, and even starting even earlier with the protests against the cancellation of an LGBT pride parade. That's another long story, but the point being that the newer dissidents of the last 2 or 3 years are way more media savvy than their predecessors. They're also framing it in ways that are less alienating to the vast majority of the Cuban population. They're focusing on things that most Cubans agree on. Democratization is good. We need political reforms. We need this. We need that. So by focusing on those as kind of wedge issues and then kind of leaving the kind of more conservative or more like economic change things until kind of later once, it got foot in the door, I would say.
Yeah, Andres, how do people on the island think of the U.S. role here? And let's put up this Marco Rubio tweet. I think this is 106. Rubio is absolutely just salivating, the last 2 days over the possibilities, and Democrats in Florida as well, also salivating. So what he's saying here is, hey, don't forget that Asada Shakur is also in Cuba, and so. This is a chance for us to go in there maybe and snatch her. Like that's the implication there, which seems rather off message. If Rubio's saying that really what he's concerned about is economic reforms and the well-being of the Cuban people, maybe he should have saved that one for down the road once troops have kind of actually hit the beach there. But so how do Cubans think about the American role here? The U.S. has had its eye on Cuba for centuries. I saw one video going around with an American flag, which to me I'm not sure would be that effective given the kind of antagonistic role between the countries.
So I think that I think that there's a very clear differentiation for most Cubans between the U.S. government and the U.S. people. And it's been an explicit talking point to the government, too, for decades. So it's like so in terms of like the U.S. government's role, I think that Rubio and I think the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, also said something similar, like basically calling for intervention and stuff. I think what they're doing is actually they're feeding the flames of a kind of more nationalist defense of the Cuban Revolution as the alternative to a neocolonial regime under the U.S., right? I mean, that's like, people often talk about Cuba as a communist country, but if you really want to understand the staying power of the Cuban government, you need to understand it as a nationalist movement and a nationalist government that focuses on national symbols and sovereignty. That's why even the vaccine is called soberana, sovereign, right? So by the hyper-aggressive right talking about these things, they're ironically feeding like they're giving the exact kind of fodder that if they were smart they wouldn't do to the Cuban government to do all kinds of anything they see as necessary in order to get the protests under control. So that's
and it's not just the U.S. that's had its eye on Cuba for decades. It's also hostile foreign powers, and I think that's still what Republicans are reacting to. This reminds me, actually, we were just going to start talking about how the U.S. media has paid little attention to the protests in Haiti, and we can get that up on the screen here. The media never cared about Haitians protesting their capitalist dictatorship for literally months, in the streets every day getting slaughtered by police. But a few hundred people in Cuba marched one time, and every U.S. media outlet has reporters on the ground immediately. So the protests that have been going on in Haiti for months, Haitians in uproar against their dictatorship. However, there were thousands, not just, that was on a larger scale than what we saw in
a general strike.
Right.
Here you got several hundred,
Right, yeah, than what we saw in Cuba over the weekend, at least. And there's an interesting difference here in that Cuba is not far from the shores of the United States, and that's always been a source of immense concern, especially throughout the Cold War, for Americans and for the American government. Do you think that explains some of the discrepancy here in the coverage of Haiti and Cuba, in that there's still this fear of Cuba being used by hostile foreign governments? How legitimate that fear is totally up for debate, but I think that explains the reaction that we see, certainly on the right and in some quarters of the establishment left. Do you think that explains the difference or the disparity in media coverage between what we saw in Haiti and what we've seen in Cuba, or is there another explanation, or is it a combination of factors, perhaps?
So I think that I think that's part of it, but especially after the Cold War, it's been less of the equation, right? I mean, part of the reason that after the end of the Cold War, it's been so hard to normalize relations with Cuba has been that Cuba just isn't a priority. No one wants to expend political capital. It's not important enough to pay attention to. I mean, Kissinger was one of the people who tried to normalize relations with Cuba specifically to head off kind of Cuba being used as kind of a beachhead or whatever. You know, if he can at least talk to them, he can kind of restrict what Cuba can potentially become from a national security standpoint. I think that the core of this is that Florida is important in general elections. That's what most of this boils down to. I mean, you have plenty of Republicans who would be happy to see, would have been for years happy to see a normalization of relations with Cuba because they are representing ag states. And Cuba imports 70 to 80% of its food, part of why the sanctions are doing such a big, a lot of damage to everyday people, because Cuba imports its food and it doesn't have enough capital to buy food. But the people like these Republicans, both in the House and the Senate, would be happy to see more trade with Cuba because it would benefit their constituents. But because of how central Florida is in general elections, and how Rubio and all these other Cuban American Republicans will fight tooth and nail to keep these sanctions on. I think that's kind of the core of trying to understand Cuban GOP messaging on Florida right now.
Well, Andres, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.